Okay, so I will gently get us started while people join. It's great to see so many people from government and civil society around the world interested in this webinar, where we'll be discussing two big global summits upcoming at the end of the year. The OGP 10th Anniversary Global Summit, hosted by the government of Korea with Maria Baron, the civil society co-chair of OGP, and the US government hosted Summit for Democracy. So a big welcome from OGP to this briefing. And just some logistical announcements at the top. So this is a Zoom webinar format, which I'm sure many of you are now familiar with. That means that you can ask questions using the Q&A function throughout the webinar. You can also use the chat function to ask questions or carry on a discussion. And there will also be an opportunity for some people to ask questions directly by audio when we get to the Q&A section of this meeting. This is a public meeting, so it is being recorded. It is live for anyone to join from around the world. And the recording will be posted after the meeting, so those who weren't able to attend will be able to watch back. And we'll share that link with all participants. So why are we holding this briefing? These big two summits at the end of the year are clearly major political opportunities, but they really require strategic thinking, planning, and advocacy to make the most of them. Over the past few years, OGP has been playing a role to help connect multilateral fora like these two summits to concrete national policies and reforms that involve civil society. And we see these two as an important opportunity to build on these efforts. Of course, the context for these two summits is a tricky one for open government and democracy globally. We've seen 15 consecutive years of declining civic space and democratic backsliding in many parts of the world. But we've also seen incredible innovation and reform and countries opening up at the same time. In the context of COVID, of course, as well, we know there have been well-documented trends on emergency powers without proper democratic oversight, major challenges with openness in procurement and spending and such like, but also really incredible innovation in terms of government working with civil society to protect lives and livelihoods. So the opportunity coming up is to really try and continue to build a coalition for open government and democracy of leaders at national and local levels, civil society, private sector, working to advance specific reforms that can help to strengthen democracy. The risk is that we know these global summits do not always translate into real action and reform. We know that too often leaders make high-level speeches on topics like open government, and then the follow-through is weak. We know commitments are not always implemented. And we also know that too often summits can become closed spaces, which are dominated by intergovernmental discussions without space for citizens and civil society to engage on the actual substance of what has been agreed and what commitments countries are making. So in this webinar, we'll discuss strategies to maximize the opportunities and minimize the risks. And we have a great set of speakers to help us with this discussion. I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn before they give their remarks. And as I mentioned, please use this Q&A format to post questions throughout, which we'll try to answer. Firstly, though, I want to provide a brief factual state of play on each summit so that we can share the facts up front, and then our speakers can more explore strategies and ideas with all of you. So firstly, on the US hosted Summit for Democracy, as OGP, we are keen to maximize the opportunities of this summit But of course, we are not the organizers. So we can only share today what we know. And there are things that we don't know that we can't share. The aim is to provide information so that it can be in the hands of all of you, reformers around the world, to see what opportunities exist in your countries. So we know that approximately just over 100 countries have been invited, including over 60 OGP members at leader level. We know that civil society speakers have also been invited, and that there will be a number of partner-led events in the run-up to the summit, in addition to the plenary sessions themselves. We know the themes are anti-corruption, human rights, and countering authoritarianism. And we know that under each theme, there are subtopics, for example, expanding civic space, media freedom, ending emergency restrictions related to the pandemic, and specific anti-corruption reforms, such as on procurement or beneficial ownership and so on. We know that leaders are expected to make commitments in those areas in their speeches, and that there will be a follow-up summit at the end of 2022 to check in on progress. Countries are expected to work with civil society on shaping those commitments, both before December's summit, in terms of what the leaders will say, and next year in turning those high-level commitments into specific plans and into action. The US government has also explicitly encouraged governments to leverage existing mechanisms where pledges and commitments have already been made, such as OGP. So we think the OGP fora, as we'll hear from some of our speakers, could have a key role to play, given the thematic alignment between some of the topics I mentioned and the open government agenda, but also because many of you are already pushing relevant reforms that could benefit from high-level attention and could help to increase the ambition and implementation of those reforms. So we're actively encouraging civil society engagement in the Summit for Democracy, but of course, we cannot speak to all of the decisions being made around the planning of it. So that's on the US Summit for Democracy. Briefly on the OGP Summit, all 78 national and 76 local members are invited. That's government and civil society. The event, of course, will be fully open to all. There'll be a high-level opening plenary with President Moon, with Maria, and other leaders from government and civil society. And there'll be plenaries on anti-corruption, civic space, and inclusive digital innovation. There'll also be regional sessions for each of the 4 regions, and also many partner-led events throughout that same week. There is, of course, again, an opportunity to secure political engagement on OGP. Some countries will be delivering new action plans with specific new commitments that have been co-created over the past year, and there'll be plenty of spaces to share learning and stories and exchange ideas with each other. So that's all I want to say by laying out the facts. I hope that's useful to set the stage for our speakers to really dive into some of the strategies around how to use these 2 moments. And our first speaker is Maria Barón, Executive Director of Directorio Legislativo, based in Argentina, and the lead civil society co-chair of OGP. Let me turn it to you, Maria.
Thank you, Joe. And thanks everyone for joining this morning, at least it's morning here in Argentina. Just to share a little bit or to dive into the OGP Summit in South Korea in December, and maybe think after that how to connect that with the Summit for Democracy and also some other initiatives. So you know that the co-chairs are me and the government of South Korea have put together 3 priorities, which are going to be sort of spotlighted in 3 pillars in the summit. The first one is anti-corruption, and that means, just to break the concept a little bit, it's money in politics, it's beneficial ownership transparency, it's whistleblower protection, asset recovery, extractive industries transparency, open procurement, and the like. So we are expected, or it would be good for you to propose ideas to generate discussion around those. The second pillar is a civic space, of course, that we've worked a lot during this year. And within civic space, you have, of course, freedom of expression, association, assembly, digital privacy, and basically how to work in the OGP context with the different difficulties in the different contexts. And then the third one is on digital governance. So this includes inclusive digital transformation and innovation, misuse of digital technologies, and taking into consideration the group that OGP has put together on open algorithms, and just to showcase sort of the ideas that we're expecting. But in terms of what we want, or I would want to sort of hope to see in the summit, I think I could showcase those or maybe separate those in three ideas. The first one, or the first thing that I would like to see in this summit is sort of what we call the 360 approach, in a way, sort of how to connect the local discussion to the national, to the regional, and the global. And something that OGP has made a great effort in, and maybe try to offer those discussions. One example of that is I'm sure you've been at or seen or heard, the call to action is how to connect, in this case, the national conversation with the global organization with different actors. Maybe there in that sort of approach, also how to connect the dots between the different initiatives. So for example, the Summit for Democracy and the commitments that are going to be posted there with OGP, which is something that we had wished to have done in the UK corruption summit in 2014, but we weren't able to be so effective, and we hope this year we can monitor the collective commitments together. And then one other, and also not only between summits, but also between initiatives. I think we have worked, and OGP has been really instrumental in working with OGP and OECD objectives, maybe the objectives of global organizations, sort of that approach too, and also sort of a less silo approach between communities. So the digital community, maybe the parliament community, the AI community, or the open extractives in a community. Maybe try to think on how to coagulate, on how to create initiatives or ideas more creatively to work together and have more muscle around that. Then the third would be, the second, would be sort of this ideal or objective that we've had with the government of Korea. And I know that this is in the agenda of all of the organization, and it's how to engage high-level political leaders and get that engagement from the different governments, which is something that we're working at. We haven't got it. I know that many people are in that sort of quest of how to get it. Let's think more creatively and bring that to the summit, how to address that, which is something that all of the organizations of the different countries are sort of working at and protest, in the sense that they always want to get more engagement from the governments, and usually they don't get it. How to address that veto from the different actors that we want to influence. And then the third and last, how to use this summit as an action forcing moment. How can we sort of work together to generate in the or during the summit new ideas and new connections, how to capture all those new connections and new ideas, taking them forward into 2022. So just, I think I'm past my time. So back to you, Joe.
Great, Maria, thanks so much. Really clear suggestions on connecting the global to the national, breaking down some of these silos between different policy areas that help open government and strengthen democracy, engaging high-level political leadership, and making sure these summits are really about action. So next, I would like to turn to Gary. So Gary Kalman is the director of the US Office of Transparency International. And specifically, Gary, I was hoping we could hear from you about some of the opportunities around anti-corruption, given, as you heard from Maria, it's both a top priority for the OGP Summit and for the Summit for Democracy. Over to you, Gary.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks OGP to inviting us here. Glad to be here and really looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Lots to discuss in 5 minutes, so I'm going to try and hit highlights, and if there's things I miss, hopefully we can catch those in the Q&A. Before I jump into sort of the specifics, I just want to say, reiterate what Maria said about not having these summits operate in a silo. Somebody referred to this year as the season of summits, looking at the UN special session, the G7, the G20, and so many others, including the Summit for Democracy and the OGP Summit. And so having a Summit for Democracy in isolation and not recognizing that countries have already come together and made a bunch of commitments is not going to be the most, I think, productive way to move the agenda forward. And so hopefully recognizing those commitments and figuring out how we actually can see action, as people have talked about. I'm going to focus on the anti-corruption pillar, as Joe said. I do want to also mention that there was a lot of optimism at the early part of the year as the Biden administration came out with what it called its National Security Study Memorandum. It was a memorandum that said, basically outlined that the US government now for the first time recognizes that corruption is a core national security interest. The memorandum directed about 200 agencies to come back, in 200 days, to come back from all the agencies with plans on how they're going to incorporate anti-corruption measures into their national security framework. And so there was a lot of optimism that that was going to actually get agencies to focus on this, and hoping that we can leverage some of that for the summit. Summit planners have put forth 5 issue areas that they believe are going to be, they've called them themes, examples of the kinds of issues and issue areas to be discussed at the summit, but they've used the same 5 issue areas numerous times. So there's reason to believe that these are going to sort of be the areas around which the anti-corruption pillar discussions focus. So let me run through those, and then some additional things that I think civil society would like to see at the summit, and see if we can expand the window here. As Joe mentioned some of them, but just to go through them, beneficial ownership transparency. They're saying beneficial ownership transparency according to the FATF recommendations. As many people may know, FATF just released a draft of its updated recommendations, and there's a comment period. It's better than I think some of us thought, not as good as we were hoping for. But it offers an opportunity for us and this summit to then put pressure on FATF to make that as strong as possible. And so that is a new opportunity at the summit, because the FATF recommendation is not complete. So that's one area, and happy to go through specifics if people want. The second area is real estate transparency. Here in the US, we imagine that means an expansion of what's called the geographic targeting orders. This is the collecting of beneficial ownership information for higher risk real estate transactions in certain jurisdictions. We think it should be massively expanded, and I think that talking to other countries and working through similar models to expand that could be a helpful, again, first step in moving towards broader real estate transparency. The third is on foreign bribery. I think there's 2 things to look for here. One is a focus on enforcement. Transparency International does a report periodically, and last year's report looked at 47 countries. Of the 47 countries looked at for their anti-bribery laws and enforcement, it found that only 4 were actively enforcing the anti-bribery laws. I think there needs to be a focus, obviously, on getting countries to figure out what the problems are and moving forward towards greater enforcement. And then the second, which was also, this was mentioned specifically, it was one of the few specific areas that was mentioned in President Biden's national security memo that I mentioned before, was, at least in the US, expanding our current anti-bribery laws to not only include the offering of bribes, but the demand side of bribery. Many countries around the world already have this. It's time for the US to join the rest of our allies around the world and work together to actively enforce those laws. Excuse me, the last two pieces are in transparency in contracting and transparency in foreign aid. And there's a number of issues we can get into later on. Obviously, there are additional issues that civil society would like to see included, and some of which have been mentioned by Joe and Maria. I would also add, though, one of the key things that we're looking at here in the United States is better, an expansion of customer due diligence rules, knowing who your customers are, to the gatekeepers, regulating the gatekeepers to the financial system. Right now in the US, we do have banks and some gatekeepers, but we don't include lawyers, accountants, art dealers, sellers of planes and yachts, and a whole variety of gatekeepers that we'd like to see covered. In the other parts of the world, in the EU and elsewhere, there are regulations in place, but there's questions about how well they're enforced. There's a series of other things I was going to go through, but realizing I'm running out of time here, I want to say one important thing here about what we're hoping that the summit and trying to frame, so this goes to the strategy discussion, trying to frame these discussions not just being around making commitments, because as we've said in other fora, there's been numerous commitments made, including in OGP over several years, that we want to see either implemented, like created, or where commitments have been implemented, but not implemented in ways that have been effective, to figure that out and move forward so that they're more clearly, better implemented. And so having the conversations that go why rather than just what, I think is a critical piece of this. A lot of people say, look, these commitments aren't being made because of political will. That's true for a lot of them, but it's not the only reason that commitments haven't been implemented. And I think there's opportunities, some of which are resources, some of training, some of this international cooperation. There's a number of reasons that commitments haven't been implemented. And if we could have the conversation about why, then we can begin to move forward. Last thing I'll say is after this summit, I will say invitations went out a little late. And so the engagement with civil society and co-creating commitments in the various countries that have been invited is going to be a very rushed process, unfortunately, for this year. We're less than 2 months away, I think, from the summit, and invitations just went out a few weeks ago, and civil society is just getting up to speed. So what they're now talking about is, after this summit, having a year of action in which they may create or try and utilize and work with existing structures on creating champion cohorts around a number of these issues that we're talking about, and using that year for multi-stakeholder communities to come up with better, stronger, and more robust commitments for next year's summit. And so I think that is one thing we want to be able to focus on in this year's summit, and make sure that those cohorts or those existing structures that we're going to sort of anoint as coming up with commitments for next year, is that civil society is very engaged in that process, so we have a better sense of what we're going to be able to get next year, and not just leave it to whatever comes out of this year. So let me stop there. Thank you very much again, and happy to engage in the Q&A when time.
Thanks so much, Gary and Maria, our two civil society speakers to open the webinar. And as you said, focusing on the why, I think it is a really good progress that corruption is now being viewed as a core threat to democracy. It's not something to be, put to one side, but it's absolutely central to a healthy democracy is tackling corruption. But the reasons why are not just policy, they're also politics, they're financial, they're technical, as you said, and we need to make sure that we don't just create litanies of new commitments that then don't actually get to the heart of the problem. So thanks so much for also going through the policy agenda. Please do add your questions to the Q&A. I can see we have one question already. We'll make sure we come back to that. But first, I want to turn to our government speakers. And we're going to start with Alhaji Abu Bakar, who is the Registrar General at the Corporate Affairs Commission in Nigeria. And actually a good link to what Gary was saying, because one of the topics you mentioned was on beneficial ownership. And I know, Abu Bakar, this is your area where there's been some good progress, and we're keen to hear how you perceive the utility of these big global moments for these national reforms and for reformers like yourself. Over to you, Abu Bakar.
Thank you, Joe, and good afternoon or good morning all, depending on where you are. For us in Nigeria, and for those that have been following developments in Nigeria, our journey on beneficial ownership disclosure started in 2016 when our president made a commitment during the London Anti-Corruption Summit that Nigeria was going to establish a publicly available register of beneficial owners of companies. Since 2016, because of the absence of legal framework, that could not be achieved immediately. After Nigeria joined the OGP and the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, and the co-creation between the civil society and government led to a lot of initiatives that finally led to the amendment of the Companies and Allied Matters Act to provide for disclosure of persons with significant control. Nigeria adopted the UK model of PSC, but with a lower threshold of 5% as opposed to 25% in the UK. The Companies and Allied Matters Act was passed by the Nigeria's parliament in 2020, and the bill was assented to by the president on the 7th of August 2020. CSE, or the agency I am heading, as the Corporate Affairs Commission, is the implementation agency of that particular commitment. And beneficial ownership disclosure has been one of the key areas of commitment in our National Action Plan 1 and National Action Plan 2. With the passage of the law, we had to quickly start the process of establishing the register. We made some changes to our electronic system to allow for submission of information about persons with significant control for all entities, all companies registered in Nigeria, and recently for limited liability partnerships. The system has been up and running since the 3rd of January this year. All companies registered from 3rd of January must mandatorily disclose where you have any shareholder holding directly or indirectly 5% of the shares or 5% of the voting rights, or anybody can appoint, has the authority to appoint majority of the directors, or to exact any form of influence or control over the way and manner the company is managed. That disclosure has to be made at the time the company is registered, or when there is any change in the capacity of such person, or when anybody becomes a PSC within the definition of this threshold. And whenever the company is filing annual returns, that disclosure has to be made in the annual return. The essence of making the disclosure in the annual return is to enable us cross-check whether the previous filings made either at incorporation or the changes made within the year are consistent with the return made by the company when it is filing its returns. And we are not just collecting this information, we are also publishing the information on our company registration portal, on the public search, on pre.cac.gov.ng. But the disclosure is made, the publication is made on individual company basis. We have an approved grant from the OGP Multi-Donor Fund to extend the system, to provide it in open data format. That is still in progress. We've not yet accessed the grant, although we've been discussing with the World Bank, so that the process will be achieved as quickly as possible. And we have made available our database to all investigation agencies in Nigeria, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, the Nigerian Police, the Independent Corruption and Commission, as well as the Interpol. And we have a close collaboration with the tax authority, as well as the Bureau for Public Procurement. We have an application program interface for all entities that are applying for public procurement. The information is validated by the public authority, by the Bureau of Public Procurement, before such contracts are awarded. And for every other agency of government, we have made this information, we've given them access, including foreign missions in Nigeria. Those that apply, we've given them access at no cost. They can access any information on any registered entity in Nigeria. So I must emphasize that this wouldn't have been achieved without the strong collaboration with the civil society. I could recall last year when we had issues with getting the law passed by the National Assembly, the intervention of CISLAG, or Transparency International in Nigeria, in engaging the legislature and other relevant agencies to get this law passed, and the OGP as well, because Mr. Sanjay was in Nigeria. He had meetings with the Attorney General of the Federation and other stakeholders, where he emphasized the need to have the enabling legal framework. All these have gone a long way to enable us have this system in place within this limited period. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abubakar. And I think this is really important, right? Because this is the detailed work that follows these big global summits where leaders make speeches and commitments. And going back to 2016, when President Buhari first made that announcement of a priority on beneficial ownership, this is 5 years on, all the work that has to be done to implement. So to Gary's point, it takes a lot of detailed work after the big headline moment. And that was really helpful for us to understand on that specific issue, how you and your team have managed to take it forward. So we're now going to move to another part of the world, to Canada. We are pleased to welcome two speakers from the Government of Canada, which I think is hopefully going to show us a good example of how foreign ministries and domestically focused ministries can work together on this agenda. So we're going to start with Catherine Godin, who's the Director General of the Office of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion at Global Affairs Canada. That's the Foreign Ministry of Canada. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's a pleasure to be with this extraordinarily international audience from all continents. It's an absolute joy. And of course, to my Francophone colleagues, I'll express myself in French to saluer tout le monde avec grand plaisir. Thank you very much for having us today. So I don't want to take too much time because obviously I want to share the stage here with my colleagues, Madame Robert, and perhaps just highlight the fact that for us, the Summit for Democracy offered a formidable opportunity to really harness and support the OGP process and focus towards implementation. I believe it was Gary who was highlighting the importance of implementation. For us, the idea is really to kind of connect this from a concrete perspective. So we very much welcome this innovative approach to have something that is both outwardly focused and internally focused and really make the two work together from a collaborative perspective. So our approach has been really focused on coordination and collaboration, and inherently for us that includes a multi-stakeholders approach with civil society, and that's not meant to be just at the touch point at either the Summit for Democracy or indeed the summit in Republic of Korea, but effectively through the year of action, which the summit is expected to see unfold. So obviously the challenge and the opportunity, I dare say here, is to avoid silos, to effectively harness those two complementary strengths, the outward focus and the domestic focus, and really hopefully blow some wind in the sails of the OGP process in doing so. So our approach from a foreign affairs perspective is really focused on inclusive democracy. which means effectively not just hearing the voices of all partners invested in democracy, but effectively taking on board what we hear. So that requires for our Foreign Affairs Department to work with Treasury Board. Of course, Treasury Board, and Madame Robert will explain, is the equivalent in some countries. It might be the Department of Interior, and that will take various shapes. But for us, that docking, that collaboration is really essential. And at the end of the day, from a Treasury Board perspective, it's really to ensure that there's a concrete monitoring, ongoing process through the year of actions. Once, as you've explained, Joe, the year and the second summit takes place for the leaders. So effectively, I guess what I want to finish with and wrap up is to really indicate that connection and concreteness of results is really what we're seeking with those two departments working together for I'll call them the December events. So that's a bit more perspective, and perhaps I could turn it over to Mélanie to pick up the baton from a domestic perspective. Thank you.
Merci, Catherine. So I'm Mélanie Robert. I'm points of contact for the OGP and the Executive Director of Open Government in Canada. I'll go into a lot more detail to be very granular, talking about some of the challenges and opportunities we saw. The difficulty is this happened while we were in the middle of an election. Cabinet just got formed. So this really limited our ability to reach out and to make any definitive decisions, but we still wanted to be sure that public servants would be ready to provide advice once cabinet would come. So what we did is we identified the similarities between the Summit for Democracy themes and our own fifth NAP themes that had been coming across through our consultations. And we did find a lot of similarities, authoritarianism, corruption, human rights, aligning very well with our themes of combating disinformation, ensuring fair elections, justice, and financial and corporate transparency. Then what we did is saw that we could actually capitalize from the previous work done through our co-creation process and our consultations from the fifth NAP. And concretely, what we did is actually convened many director generals, all those who had been involved in those teams in the National Action Plan, but also others who could be involved in the themes of the Summit for Democracy. And we joined forces, which was great, and then explained what these two summits were. Some of them knew one, but not the other. And basically explain how the National Action Plan process was a ready-to-use, proven process that in Canada we're at our fifth National Action Plan that could help them implement and track the Summit for Democracy commitments in a transparent and accountable way. So basically trying to say, if you don't already have a commitment in the National Action Plan and you are thinking of a commitment for the Summit for Democracy, you might want to think about including it in the National Action Plan. We made sure that everyone received the input that we had collected in very granular level from our consultations and from our MSF and shared this so that they could develop their thinking based on past public input. So this has been very beneficial so far, and reaching to areas that maybe the National Action Plan would allow us to reach out to. Our foreign affairs have entries in places we don't, and I think vice versa, but also proposing almost a turnkey process to accelerate the thinking and benefit from synergies, break the silos, as Maria is saying. And I think it helped the people involved in the National Action Plan to see how their commitments could be of interest to other forums. Now we're exploring a lot, how can we track progress using some of the tools that we've used in a National Action Plan process. We have used quite a rigorous process in the past where our members of civil society, and Rob is here today from our civil society multi-stakeholder forum, our members of the multi-stakeholder forum get directly in front of the commitment holders, the public servants, to ask them quarterly or twice a year about the implementation and ask questions and also provide suggestions when you're mired into execution difficulties. So we're trying to remain flexible about this process. It could impact, for example, the timelines around the fifth NAP, but so far it's been a very, very beneficial exercise, I think, for both groups, for foreign affairs and for open government.
Great. Thanks so much, Catherine and Melanie. I think it's a really interesting example. I was taking lots of notes as both of you were speaking, but it is really this, this infrastructure which allows co-creation across government and outside of government, the specificity, the monitoring and the tracking. These are all elements, right, that are not always seen in global summits. And that's where I think we're trying to make this connection, use this infrastructure to maximize these big political opportunities and put, I really like that, the metaphor, put the wind in the sails of the reformers and the OGP process where possible. So our final speaker, and please do continue to add questions and answers, questions, and we'll try to answer them in the Q&A format. Our final speaker is Philip Tigo. So Philip is also the OGP point of contact in Kenya, but is Senior Advisor for Data and Innovation in the Office of the Deputy President. I'm keen to hear from Philip, given your experience of both the kind of global and national and where you sit in government in quite a political place. How do you see this kind of these two opportunities coming up being helpful for reformers such as yourself?
Thanks so much, John, and thanks for everybody for listening. I think for Kenya, and this is, I try to sort of shape this a little bit differently, because as Nigeria, we also were part of the Anti-Corruption Summit. Like Canada, this is our fourth NAP. Our sort of thinking over the last, let me just say 10 years, because we have been in OGP in 10 years, but also we have been basically the same people who've been shaping the discourse around reform, is that we have found out over the years is that it's good to anchor these summits, or this what we call, I know somebody has talked about, we call them event-forcing dates or catalytic moments, to be able to sort of amplify a specific area that requires more attention, more focus, more funding, but also multi-stakeholder collaboration. And so our constants have always been our constitution, especially the second one that was very much heavy on citizen engagement and public participation, and of course, strengthening democracy. But the second one is OGP as the only multi-stakeholder network that we know of that sort of provides equality in engagement. So it's not only a member state or government space, but it's a space where you have both national, subnational governments, but also civil society having an equal voice. And when we talk about democracy and consolidating democracy around trust, then you actually need a space like that. So that's what we've been able to do. And so these summits over time have simply been moments where we all agree to say, listen, what is it that we need to focus on to amplify, to meet the country's sort of public policy or foreign policy agenda, which is more or less to celebrate what Kenya wants to showcase, right? But then at the same time, ensure that we deepen democracy in country. So for those of you who know us, we came very hard around the global goals to ensure that we have the global goals are anchored in an open, transparent, and democratic way. So our OGP focus in that specific aspect at global level was to ensure that we leverage data to create visibility, but also accountability, and domesticate that at national level on how you cascade the global goals. So that's what we did. For the COP21, it was the same, where climate, as you know, was ravaging the continent, leveraging both OGP and our constitution to enact the first ever climate change law. Again, multi-stakeholder, driven both by government and civil society. Now coming COP26 next week, actually, and my president is going on Saturday, is also simply to showcase what we've been able to do collaboratively between civil society and government. Of course, at the Anti-Corruption Summit, what happened was we did some pre-work. And the pre-work we did was, again, how do we ensure that we can reduce opportunities for corruption, both nationally, but also create some form of international collaboration among champions, which is what we did. Of course, we enacted a Beneficial Ownership Act. We have civil society very much embedded. We created a separate state agency based on civil society voice around accessibility. And so that continues to be one of the pieces that we collaborate with civil society. And again, of course, everything we do, and we realize that as much as it's work, it has to be anchored in law. And so again, engaging parliament, engaging engaging the judiciary, because a lot of these things also have to be adjudicated, so that a summit is not an end by itself, but a summit is simply an opportunity to consolidate and galvanize action around a specific issue, whether it's climate now, or now democracy, or the global goals, when that comes into focus. And I think finally, and this is something that we take very seriously, is simply thinking through how do we ensure that that in a true sense, that we are building opportunities for shared values. And I think that's really the issue. So for me, summits, yes, but ultimately that's a stage. Once you leave the stage, what does it mean for country, for the in-country work, but also for the continent, but more or less for transformation? And so I think, Joe, I will end with that, is to the extent that yes, summits come and go, but ultimately it's the work that we do during and after. And then how does that lead into transformation and into service delivery for citizens?
Great, thanks so much, Philip. And I think it's a really good place to leave us in terms of the shared values of these summits is not to be taken for granted anymore, right? I mean, that's the reality of the experience in many parts of the world, in many countries, is that this backsliding can happen anywhere. No one is immune. And it's really for, I think, how we build these more, a coalition, right? A coalition of champions and reformers, which also realizes that countries sometimes take a step back and then take 2 steps forward, as I think President Obama in 2016 at the OGP Summit said in his video. So there are a few questions that have come in on the Q&A that we will try to collectively address. There are several from Alex Howard around the US domestic situation. Maybe I will just briefly say on OGP domestically in the US, and then there's a really good question about parliaments and the balance between legislation and voluntary commitments that maybe I can turn to Maria, and also around beneficial ownership, where maybe Gary, you might be able to come in on that question. But I can just say on OGP, we obviously, as the institution, are very much hoping that the US domestic OGP process will get a boost from these 2 summits, that there will be a re-engagement process with civil society and the equivalents of Philip and Melanie and Catherine and Abu Bakr in the US government. And that's something that I think all of us would like to see as part of the US domestic commitments for the Summit for Democracy. So the US itself will be making commitments as well as other countries. Obviously, we're not the US government and can't speak for the US government, but we're certainly hoping to see that re-engagement. Maria, there's also, if you could, another question just came in on Parliament. So from Devon O'Shaughnessy, which is also around Open Parliament Day sessions and how to link these 2. So if you could also take that one with your intervention, and then I'll turn to Gary.
Thank you, Joe. Just to address first Alex's question, I think, Alex, you have sort of 2 issues in your questions around all of your questions. The first one is sort of the more philosophical issue is OGP useful or is OGP effective? And then the second one, of course, is on the US situation and the US process and how difficult it is. I think to address the second one first, like Joe was saying, it's difficult to understand OGP's structure or governance sort of scheme, but it's, from my perspective, from my role, we can address the issue through the steering committee, and we have done that in the past with different countries or different cohorts of organizations that work at the national processes. You just have to sort of come in with us and try to strategize together. We've done it with Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Paraguay, every day, every week, because there's problems everywhere. We need to address those, and even problems that are really, personal security problems. And in some way, I can say we have, all in all, addressed a little bit of those. Of course, we don't have, we're not the global police force, but we can think creatively. The first issue is OGP useful? Like, if you ask me, of course, I'm here, I've devoted thousands of hours of my time to this. I think all in all, without OGP, the world would be a less fair world than it is today. But of course, it's a counter factor. I can probably, mention three things that sort of we've focused on and that address in a way the issue, and all the hours that we spend in OGP sort of are directed to that. The first one is, and especially those that have been involved in OGP from the get-go, from 2011. And so this is something that we're thinking all the time. It's not new for us. So we started, one of the things that's really relevant, we started discussing in 2011 with Obama and everything, transparency and open government. And now we shifted, of course, from that to civic space. And in many cases, free and fair elections, democracy in itself. So, the moving target has showed us that we need to address, the countries that are working, like I said before, in the working group of AI, and then the countries that don't have free and fair elections again, anymore. I mean, then the second thing is that we've been working a lot is how to connect that reality that people are going through in the ground to what we talk to, or to what we talk about in OGP. So that connection, that how to make our discussion meaningful to the people that are on the ground. And that's why OGP has opened the local program, not only for civil society, but also for public officials that really work hand in hand with what is happening day to day, hour by hour. And then the third thing is the civic space issue that I mentioned many times already. And it's how, so the discussion within us in the steering committee is how to address the pressing issues that are in the countries that cannot go through the formalities of discussing and co-creating and creating commitments, and then is the action plans, and then the evaluation of the action plans. They need like a more creative approach. And that's what we've done. We've had many sort of examples that are, I think, really useful and creative. And then that, just to address that and throw the beans on the table. And then on the open parliament, which you mentioned, Alex, as well. So there's going to be an open parliament day, like in every summit. Devin, you know, because you're part of the partners that work in open. So that open parliament day is going to have parliamentarians from all over the world, and there's going to be at least 2 sessions. We're thinking of having 3 that will address sort of geographically the different issues that arise in the different parts of the world. So we're going to have one on the Americas, one Europe, Africa, and then Asia. And then there's another sort of way of including so the open parliament in the summit, which is including the open parliament lens in the different discussions that there are going to be. And then just a little bit, and with this I'll finish, Joe, I see you're nervous, is the issue about the Parliament or the Congress of the United States. We haven't worked with any organization that has that approach, Alex, yet, but we have worked with all of the organizations of all of the countries. I would say that we're missing the US sort of lens. I would welcome you to come and discuss with us and see how are the best approaches to include parliamentarians, which are really, really needed in the discussion of open government. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Quickly over to Gary, and then I see a couple more questions I'd like to get to.
Yeah, I'll be really short. Thanks, Joe. I feel like some of these questions, just to take a step back, I think what we know, so maybe I'm just stating the obvious, is that sure, some governments are going to be worse and some governments are going to be better, but no government is going to do this stuff voluntarily on their own. And so we have to organize campaigns to push them to do that. Some campaigns are going to be successful and some campaigns are not. I think I appreciate the fact what Maria was saying is constantly taking a look at the work you're doing, seeing what's working and what's not working, and reevaluating strategies and making changes. I think all too often groups, shouting, we're yelling at government and we're not actually always making progress. And so we have to rethink. I would actually say that the beneficial ownership campaign, while not perfect, and it is not a public registry, which we admit is a huge flaw, but getting this after a 10-year fight, we were able to put together a coalition that overcame some pretty powerful forces. So I do think that there's opportunities for progress. I think in certain areas we are making them, but it's our willingness as civil society to rethink and look at what we're doing and being more effective in pushing governments to do it. No one's should be patting governments on the back for not doing anything. But I do think obviously they're the ones that make the decisions. So we have to figure out how to move them. And OGP's willingness to reinvent itself in many ways, strategy-wise is what I mean, I think is one way to do it. And hopefully we can work together to make progress. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Gary. And yeah, this is really a community that wants to change the status quo. We're trying to work together on how, and that requires some unusual coalitions. And as you said, you and Maria both laid it out really, really clearly. Nikhil Datta, I from International Center for Nonprofit Law, I see you wanted to come in. Nikki, are you there?
Yeah, hi, Joe. Hi, all. I just wanted to, very briefly discuss a little bit how ICNL and our partners, how we're viewing this as an opportunity to advance reforms on civic space. As Maria has said, as you've said, civic space is really going to be a priority at these summits. It's going to be, the first plenary session, the OGP Summit, is going to be devoted to civic space. We anticipate that civic space themes are going to be very important throughout the sessions at the summit. And at the Summit for Democracy, civic space is going to be a key part of the countering authoritarianism and protecting human rights pillars. So there's going to be a lot of high-level attention to civic space at the summit, but also in the year that the summit is kicking off. And this presents a lot of opportunities for us to push on this. That's the first point. The second point is that even though commitments should be locally tailored, there are going to be a lot of opportunities across the OGP coalition and across the Summit for Democracy to advance civic space issues. Emergency powers presents one good example of that I think a lot of governments within OGP or at the summit, there's scope for them to enter into commitments to develop processes to relax the emergency measures that they've enacted in response to COVID. Another example is internet shutdowns. There's a lot of scope across OGP and across the summit to consider commitments to keep the internet on, especially in the context of peaceful protests. And just the third thing that we're really envisioning is that this is going to be a year of engagement. So it's not necessarily at this first kickoff Summit for Democracy that the action on civic space is going to take place, but that there may be opportunities to co-create commitments after the Summit for Democracies, that after the OGP Summit, even countries that have delivered their NAPs, there's an opportunity for them to enter into challenge commitments. So there's going to be a lot of attention and opportunities to focus on civic space in the coming year. And from our perspective, the really important thing is for civil society to be coordinated within countries in order to identify really what our asks are and what the priority reforms are, and to communicate those to take advantage of this really critical sort of window when leaders are going to be paying a lot of attention to these issues. Thanks.
Thanks, Nikki. Melanie, you wanted to come in. We're coming up for time, but I want to give another quick opportunity for people to come in before we wrap up.
Do you want me to speak or?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Just wanted to say, difficult for me to opine directly on the question, but how beneficial is it for government people like me to be exposed to everything I'm hearing and seeing? This is the value of the partnership. This is the value of OGP. It might not seem that important or visible, but it is. There are very few moments where people like me from the Treasury, my colleague from Foreign Affairs, are directly exposed to everything we're seeing. And I think it's of a lot of value.
Thanks, Melanie. Any other of our panelists want to have a final word before we start to bring this to a close? I can see Abu Bakr.
Yes, Joe and other distinguished panelists. Just to lend voice to what Melanie said, we have received tremendous support from the OGP and the open ownership in terms of capacity building and technical support in the design and implementation of our technological solution. This has gone a long way in all the successes recorded so far. And I will crave for such continuous support in our journey to have this register in open data format, such that from anywhere, you can easily query the database. And we'll soon join, we're already in the leadership group. So part of the initiative is to have this information across jurisdictions exchanged. By the time that is done, we'll benefit from the information from other jurisdictions in our own anti-corruption initiative as a country. So I will just plead that this collaboration, technical support, and other forms of support should continue. And the OGP platform has been a veritable tool for pushing most of these reform initiatives. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Abubakar. So Maria, just brief final word from you. You're muted, Maria.
Sorry, 1 second, just to address one of the questions in the chat. I don't think anyone answered it. It's about the youth sort of pillar or debate. I don't know about the Summit for Democracy, but the summit in Korea will have a full day destined to the youth that is organized by the Accountability Lab and the Government of Korea. So if you want more data, we can share it with you, or you can ask Blair. That's in the call. That's for Agustina.
Okay, thanks, Maria. Any final requests, or I'll bring us to a close? Philip? No.
Thanks, Joe. No, I think I put it in the chat, and honestly, okay. As you know, I've been in civil society, now I'm in government, in fact, at the presidency. Change is hard. I've been in this process for 10 years at least, for directly working on transparency, accountability, and leveraging on technology for public service delivery. I can seriously not ever emphasize the value of inspiration that a lot of government officers get from this summit, or from these opportunities to exchange and peer learn. I can also not overemphasize the value of solidarity, because sometimes you think you are alone, but then when you realize there are other people who also with you and having the same difficulties, but then also the opportunity to co-create and build things that actually work and transform following a summit. And also, as much as we think summits are empty, those are levers, and that's what we've used. When a high-level political official makes a statement, it's a lever. Then you can then work with civil society, work with governments, especially as my government counterparts say, we are the insiders who then we can work with to ensure that those levers actually move in a way that they can. It may be slow, but at least they move for transformation. That's it.
Okay, thank you so much to all of our panelists and to all of the audience. I think, Philip, a great place to leave us. These are levers, right? They are political opportunities. We know they are not the be-all and end-all. We know open government and democracy is a really tough, long journey, and no government has it perfect. No country has it perfect. I used to live just blocks away from the Capitol building, where on January 6th, we had an attempted insurrection. So the backsliding can take place in the oldest democracies as well as the newest democracies. And I think all of us need to have that humility. But where we see these opportunities to come together, what I like about this conversation and about all of the chat is we're also broadening the definition of leader, right? This is not just about heads of state and government. It's about reformers in government, civil society, private sector, civil servants, local leaders at the subnational and city level. And it's those unusual coalitions that I think OGP represents. And the reason we wanted to hold this webinar is to provide some of the information to all of you to now take it away and see in your country, is there an opportunity? Does it make sense for you to influence what your head of state is going to say at one of these summits? Is there a specific reform that you want to push forward, as we heard from Gary and Abubakar, for example, on beneficial ownership and the story of the change on that law in the US and Nigeria? So these are opportunities, but they're only going to be realized if we collectively are smart, are networked internationally, and use each other as a support network, as Philip, you nicely put it at the end. So thank you so much for all of you for spending this hour with us. We will post this webinar publicly, and we look forward to engaging with all of you in the next few weeks as we build up to these two really important summits. Thank you.